I never imagined that serving my country would cost me my son's love. Standing in the crowded airport terminal after 18 months overseas, scanning faces for the little boy I'd left behind, I felt my heart shatter when I finally spotted him. Tommy stood beside my sister Rachel, his small hand gripping hers tightly, his eyes filled with a wariness that cut straight through me. When our gazes met across the bustling crowd, he didn't run to me with the excitement I'd dreamed about during those endless nights in Afghanistan. Instead, he stepped closer to Rachel, pressing himself against her legs like he was seeking protection from me, from his own mother. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights overhead felt harsh after months under desert sun, and the cacophony of voices seemed overwhelming after the relative quiet of base life. I adjusted my duffel bag on my shoulder and walked toward them, my combat boots echoing against the polished floor. Rachel's smile was perfect, as always, but there was something in her eyes that made my stomach clench with unease. She looked like a woman who had won something precious while I was away. "Sarah," she called out, her voice carrying that practiced enthusiasm she'd perfected over the years. "Look, Tommy, Mommy's home." But Tommy didn't look excited. He looked confused, almost afraid, and when I knelt down to his level with my arms open, he hesitated in a way that broke something fundamental inside me. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. "I missed you so much." At 4 years old, Tommy had been my whole world before I deployed. We'd read bedtime stories together every night, built elaborate Lego cities on rainy weekends, and he'd always called me his best friend. Now he stood there studying my face like I was a stranger wearing his mother's uniform. "This is your mommy, Tommy," Rachel said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Remember we talked about this? She's been away for work, and now she's back to visit." Visit, the word hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't visiting my own son, I was coming home to him, to the life I'd fought to protect half a world away. But Rachel's phrasing made it sound temporary, casual, like I was some distant relative dropping by for the holidays. Tommy finally stepped forward and gave me the most heartbreaking hug I'd ever experienced. It was polite, distant, the kind of embrace you'd give someone you barely knew but felt obligated to acknowledge. His little body remained stiff in my arms, and when I tried to hold him longer, he pulled away and reached for Rachel's hand again. The gesture was so natural, so practiced, that it was clear this had become his normal. Rachel was his security, his constant, and I was the disruption. "How was your flight?" Rachel asked as we walked toward baggage claim, Tommy between us but somehow closer to her. She was wearing one of those effortlessly elegant outfits that made her look like she'd stepped out of a magazine, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Meanwhile, I felt grimy and exhausted in my ACUs, my dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, my skin still bearing the faint tan lines from months of desert deployment. "Long," I replied, watching Tommy's face for any sign of recognition, any spark of the connection we'd once shared. "I can't wait to get home and spend time with this guy." I reached out to ruffle his hair, a gesture that used to make him giggle uncontrollably. Now he ducked away slightly, not dramatically enough to seem rude, but enough to make it clear he wasn't comfortable with my touch. "Actually," Rachel said, her tone carefully casual, "I was thinking it might be better if you stayed at my place tonight. Tommy's been sleeping in the guest room there, and I don't want to disrupt his routine too much. You know how important stability is for children." The way she said it made it sound like she was the expert on child development, and I was some amateur who didn't understand my own son's needs. I stopped walking, causing a small traffic jam as other passengers flowed around us. "Rachel, I've been gone for 18 months. I think Tommy can handle sleeping in his own room tonight." My voice carried more edge than I'd intended, but the suggestion that I couldn't take my own child home was absurd. "Of course," she said quickly, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. "I just thought it might be easier. He's been having some adjustment issues lately, and Dr. Peterson said consistency is key." Dr. Peterson, another name I didn't recognize, another person who apparently knew more about my son's well-being than I did. "Who's Dr. Peterson?" I asked, my confusion growing by the minute. Tommy's therapist, Rachel replied, as if this was common knowledge. He's been seeing her for about 6 months now, ever since the episode started. She glanced down at Tommy, who was examining his sneakers with intense concentration. Haven't we, sweetie? Episodes. Therapist. 6 months, each word felt like another piece of evidence that my life had continued without me in ways I couldn't have imagined. I'd been sending emails asking about Tommy's daily routine, his favorite foods, whether he'd lost any teeth. Nobody had mentioned therapy or episodes or any kind of problems that would require professional intervention. What kind of episodes? I asked, my voice dropping to a whisper. I didn't want Tommy to hear us discussing him like he wasn't there, but I desperately needed answers. Rachel's expression shifted to one of practiced concern, the kind of look she'd perfected during our childhood, whenever she needed to deliver bad news that would somehow make her look like the responsible one. Separation anxiety, mostly, some behavioral issues, acting out at daycare. Dr. Peterson thinks it stems from feelings of abandonment. The word abandonment hung in the air between us like an accusation. I felt like I'd been sucker punched. Abandonment? I hadn't abandoned my son. I'd served my country, fulfilled my duty, provided for our future. The deployment had been mandatory, not optional, and I'd spent every available moment video calling Tommy, sending care packages, writing letters he couldn't read yet, but that Rachel was supposed to read to him. How had my service been twisted into abandonment? I didn't abandon him, I said firmly, though my voice shook slightly. I was deployed. There's a difference. Of course there is, Rachel said quickly, but her tone suggested she didn't really believe it. It's just how children process these things. Tommy's still little. He doesn't understand the complexities of military service. He just knows Mommy wasn't here when he needed her. The guilt hit me like a physical force, settling in my chest and making it hard to breathe. Every parent who serves faces this impossible choice between duty and family, but hearing it described as abandonment by my own sister made me question everything. Had I been selfish? Had I prioritized my career over my child's emotional well-being? The rational part of my mind knew these questions were unfair, but standing there watching my son cling to his aunt while barely acknowledging me, rational thought felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. We collected my bags in silence, Tommy holding Rachel's free hand while she maneuvered my duffel bag with practiced ease. It was clear she'd become accustomed to managing the practical aspects of life that I used to handle. When we reached her car, I was surprised to see a booster seat installed in the back, the kind of expensive top-rated model that suggested this wasn't a temporary arrangement. I figured it would be easier than moving his seat back and forth. Rachel explained when she noticed my expression. He spends so much time with me anyway. The casual way she said it made it sound like joint custody was the natural order of things, like my return was just another scheduling consideration, rather than a reunion between mother and child. During the drive to my apartment, I tried to engage Tommy in conversation, asking about his favorite TV shows, his friends at daycare, whether he still loved dinosaurs as much as he had before I left. His responses were polite but minimal, and he kept looking to Rachel for approval before answering my questions. It was as if he'd been coached on how to interact with me, taught to be careful about what he said, and how he said it. Tommy's been doing so well in his art class, Rachel interjected when one of my questions was met with silence.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Haven't you, buddy? Show Mommy that drawing you made yesterday. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of construction paper. Tommy took it reluctantly and handed it to me without meeting my eyes. The drawing showed 3 stick figures standing in front of a house. The tallest figure had long yellow hair and was labeled Aunt Rachel in shaky letters. The smallest figure, obviously Tommy, stood between the tall figure and a medium-sized one with short brown hair labeled Daddy Mike. There was no 4th figure. No Mommy. I stared at the paper, trying to process what I was seeing. Who's Daddy Mike? I asked. My voice carefully controlled despite the panic rising in my throat. Mike's my boyfriend, Rachel said casually, as if this was information she'd shared before. He's been helping out with Tommy. They've gotten really close. She glanced at Tommy in the rearview mirror and smiled. Haven't you, sweetie? Mike taught you how to ride your bike without training wheels. Training wheels. I'd been planning to teach Tommy to ride his bike when I got back. We'd talked about it in our video calls, how I would run beside him holding the seat until he was confident enough to go on his own. It was supposed to be our special project, something we'd accomplish together as mother and son. Now some stranger had taken that milestone away from me, and Tommy had drawn him into our family picture while leaving me out entirely. I didn't know you had a boyfriend, I said, struggling to keep my voice neutral. Rachel and I had talked regularly while I was deployed, but she'd never mentioned anyone serious enough to be involved in Tommy's life. It's still pretty new, she said with a smile that suggested it wasn't new at all, but he's wonderful with kids. Tommy just adores him. The way she said it made it clear that Tommy's adoration of Mike was somehow more important than his relationship with me, his actual mother. When we finally reached my apartment complex, I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. This was home, the place where Tommy and I had built our life together before everything changed. The familiar brick building with its small courtyard and playground looked exactly the same, but I wondered if Tommy would remember the countless afternoons we'd spent there. The games of tag and the treasure hunts and the quiet moments on the swings when he'd tell me about his day. My apartment felt like a time capsule when I unlocked the door. Everything was exactly where I'd left it, from the throw pillows on the couch to the family photos on the mantel. Rachel had clearly been maintaining the space, probably bringing Tommy by occasionally to keep things familiar. But as we stepped inside, Tommy hung back near the entrance, looking around like he was visiting a museum rather than coming home. Look, buddy, I said, kneeling down to his level again. All your toys are still here. Your room is exactly the same. Do you want to see? I was desperate to find something that would spark recognition, some connection to the life we'd shared before I left. Tommy looked at Rachel questioningly, as if he needed permission to explore his own home. She nodded encouragingly, and he walked hesitantly toward his bedroom. I followed, my heart breaking a little more with each uncertain step he took. When we reached his room, he stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the race car bed, the shelves full of books we'd read together, the poster of dinosaurs we'd carefully chosen at the museum gift shop. Do you remember this? I asked, picking up his favorite stuffed elephant, the one he'd insisted on sleeping with every night since he was 2. Mr. Peanuts used to help chase away the scary dreams. Tommy nodded, but didn't reach for the elephant. Instead, he looked back toward Rachel, who had followed us down the hallway. We brought Mr. Peanuts to Aunt Rachel's house, Tommy said quietly. He lives there now. The simple statement felt like another small death. Even his beloved stuffed animal had been relocated, another piece of his life that had shifted away from me and toward Rachel. Peanuts can come back here sometimes, Rachel suggested, but her tone made it clear this was just a polite gesture rather than a real plan. We don't want to confuse him by moving him around too much. Confuse him, as if a stuffed elephant could be confused, as if maintaining some artificial stability was more important than reuniting a child with his mother. I was starting to see a pattern in Rachel's responses, a way of making everything sound reasonable while actually maintaining control over every aspect of Tommy's life. That afternoon, as we tried to settle into some semblance of normalcy, I began to notice other troubling signs. Tommy asked permission before touching anything in his own room, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to play with his own toys. When I suggested we make lunch together, something we'd done countless times before my deployment, he looked uncertain and said, "Aunt Rachel makes better sandwiches." When I tried to help him wash his hands, he insisted on doing it the way Rachel had taught him, with a specific soap and a particular technique that was apparently the right way. Every interaction felt like evidence of how thoroughly my role in his life had been replaced. Rachel hadn't just cared for Tommy in my absence, she'd systematically taken over every function I used to serve. She knew his current sleep schedule, his dietary preferences, his fears and favorites. Meanwhile, I felt like a stranger trying to reconnect with a child who had outgrown the mother he remembered. "He's been asking a lot of questions lately," Rachel mentioned casually as we sat in my living room while Tommy played quietly with blocks on the floor. "About why some mommies go away and don't come back. Dr. Peterson thinks it's normal for children to worry about permanence when they've experienced abandonment. There was that word again, abandonment. Rachel kept using it like it was a clinical term rather than an accusation, but each repetition felt like a knife twist. I wanted to scream that I hadn't abandoned anyone, that I'd served my country with honor while counting down the days until I could return to my son. But Tommy was right there, listening to every word, and I didn't want to upset him with an argument he couldn't understand. "I'm not going anywhere," I said firmly, looking directly at Tommy. "Mommy's home now, and we're going to spend lots of time together." But even as I said it, I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He'd learned not to trust promises about permanence, and I realized with growing horror that someone had taught him to doubt me specifically. Of course Rachel agreed, but there was something in her tone that suggested she didn't really believe I'd stick around. "Though your unit might have other deployments coming up, right? Captain Williams mentioned something about that when he called last month." I stared at my sister, confusion and anger warring in my chest. Captain Williams had no reason to call Rachel about my future assignments. She wasn't my emergency contact or next of kin for military matters. The fact that they'd been discussing my career behind my back felt like another violation, another way my life had been reorganized without my input or consent. "Why was Captain Williams calling you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "Just checking on Tommy's well-being," Rachel said with a shrug, "making sure he was adjusting okay to your absence. The military cares about family stability. You know, they don't want children suffering because of their parents' career choices." Career choices. Another loaded phrase that made my service sound selfish rather than necessary. I was beginning to understand that Rachel had spent the last 18 months carefully constructing a narrative where she was the hero and I was the absent mother who had prioritized everything else over her child's needs. The most insidious part was how reasonable she made it all sound, how she presented every criticism as concern for Tommy's well-being, rather than judgment of my choices. That evening, as I tried to establish a bedtime routine that felt familiar, the extent of the changes became even clearer. Tommy insisted on specific pajamas that weren't in his dresser, a particular bedtime story that I didn't own, and a complicated nighttime ritual involving 3 different stuffed animals and a special blanket that had apparently replaced all his old comfort items. When I suggested reading one of our old favorite books, he shook his head and asked for Aunt Rachel. "She knows the right voices for all the characters," he explained matter-of-factly. "And she doesn't forget the special parts." The implication was clear. I was an inadequate substitute for the person who had been doing this job in my absence. Every tradition we'd established, every small ritual that had bonded us as mother and son, had been replaced with new ones that centered around Rachel. I ended up calling her to come help with bedtime, a humiliation that felt like admitting defeat. She arrived within minutes, suggesting she'd been expecting the call, and efficiently guided Tommy through a routine that was clearly well established. She knew exactly which books he wanted, how he liked his pillows arranged, and what songs would help him fall asleep. Meanwhile, I stood in the doorway of my own son's bedroom, feeling like an outsider watching someone else's family. "It's normal," Rachel assured me as we sat in my living room after Tommy finally fell asleep. "Children adapt to new routines quickly. He'll remember how things used to be with you, but it might take time." Her tone was sympathetic, but there was something underneath it that felt almost satisfied, as if she enjoyed being the indispensable one. "How often has he been staying at your place?" I asked, needing to understand the scope of how much his life had shifted away from our home. "Most nights, honestly," Rachel admitted. "It was just easier, with my work schedule being more flexible than daycare hours. And Mike's been so helpful with pickups and activities. Tommy loves having a male figure around." She paused, studying my face. "I know that's probably hard to hear, but it's been really good for him. Children need stability. And with you being gone so much. As if my deployment was just the latest in a series of absences rather than an isolated period of military service. I was starting to see how skillfully Rachel had reframed the entire situation, turning 18 months of deployment into evidence of chronic absence and neglect. "I wasn't gone by choice," I said quietly, exhaustion creeping into my voice. "I was serving my country, doing my job." "I know," Rachel said, reaching over to pat my hand in a gesture that felt condescending rather than comforting. And we're all proud of your service. But Tommy's too young to understand the bigger picture. He just knows Mommy wasn't here when he needed her. She stood up and gathered her purse. I should get going. Mike's making dinner, and I promised I'd be back by 8. After she left, I sat alone in my apartment listening to the familiar sounds of my son sleeping down the hallway, but even that comfort felt tenuous. Everything about his presence here seemed temporary, conditional, like he was a guest in his own home rather than a child who belonged here. The photos on my mantle showed a different Tommy, a younger version who smiled easily and clung to me in every picture. The boy sleeping in the next room felt like a stranger wearing my son's face. I found myself wandering through the apartment, touching things that used to represent our life together. The height marks on Tommy's doorframe where we'd measured his growth, the handprint art projects we'd made on rainy days, the collection of smooth rocks he'd gathered during our walks in the park. All of it felt like archaeological evidence of a relationship that had existed in the past but no longer survived in the present. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Hi Sarah, this is Mike. Rachel gave me your number. Just wanted to say welcome home and let you know Tommy's been a great kid while you were away. Looking forward to meeting you soon." The message was friendly enough, but something about it set my teeth on edge. The casual familiarity, the assumption that we'd be meeting soon, the way he talked about Tommy like he was a shared responsibility rather than my child. I didn't respond to the text. Instead, I pulled out my laptop and started going through the photos and videos I'd accumulated during deployment. There were dozens of screenshots from our video calls, images of care packages I'd sent, pictures of letters I'd written, evidence of a mother who had stayed connected, who had maintained her relationship with her son despite impossible circumstances. But looking at them now, I wondered if Tommy even remembered those calls, if Rachel had presented them as obligations rather than expressions of love. The next morning brought another series of small revelations about how much my son's life had changed. He woke up asking for specific cereal that I didn't have, expecting a cartoon that apparently he watched every morning at Rachel's house, wondering when she would come pick him up for day camp. His day was structured around activities and people I knew nothing about, a carefully orchestrated routine that had no room for spontaneous mother-son time. When I suggested we go to the park where we used to play, Tommy agreed reluctantly, but spent the entire time telling me about the better park near Rachel's house, the one with newer equipment and more interesting climbing structures. When I pushed him on the swing, he corrected my technique, explaining that Aunt Rachel pushed differently, and it was more fun her way. Every moment felt like a comparison I was losing to someone who had become more familiar with my child than I was. "Mommy," Tommy said suddenly as we sat on a bench sharing a snack, "when are you going away again?" The question hit me like a physical blow, both because of what it implied about his expectations and because of how casually he asked it, as if my departure was inevitable rather than hypothetical. "I'm not going away, buddy," I said, pulling him closer on the bench. "Mommy's home now, we're going to spend lots of time together." But even as I said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way he'd learned not to trust promises about permanence. "Aunt Rachel said you might have to go back to work soon," he said, matter-of-factly. "She said some mommies have jobs that make them go away a lot." The way he repeated it made it clear this wasn't a casual comment but something that had been discussed multiple times, a concept that had been carefully planted in his mind. I felt a chill run down my spine as I began to understand what had been happening during my absence. This wasn't just about Rachel stepping in to help with childcare. This was about systematically undermining my relationship with my son, teaching him to expect abandonment, conditioning him to see me as unreliable while positioning herself as the stable constant in his life. "Some mommies do have jobs that require travel," I said carefully, "but that doesn't mean they love their children any less. And right now, Mommy's job is here, with you." I searched his face for any sign that he believed me, but his expression remained skeptical, as if he'd learned that adults make promises they don't keep. That afternoon, Rachel called to check in, her tone bright and cheerful as she asked about our morning together. When I mentioned Tommy's question about when I'd be leaving again, she made a sympathetic sound and said, "Poor little guy, he's learned not to get his hopes up too high. Dr. Peterson says it's a defense mechanism." Defense mechanism. Another clinical term that made my son's wariness sound like pathology rather than a learned response to systematic undermining. I was beginning to see how cleverly Rachel had orchestrated this entire situation, using my absence to rewrite the narrative of our family, while positioning herself as the expert on my child's emotional needs. "Rachel," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended, "what exactly have you been telling Tommy about my deployment?" "Just the truth," she replied innocently. "That Mommy chose to go away for work and that we didn't know when she'd come back. Children need honesty, Sarah. They can sense when adults are being deceptive." The way she said it made my service sound like a choice I'd made selfishly rather than a duty I'd fulfilled honorably. "It wasn't a choice," I said, through gritted teeth, "it was an assignment." "There's a difference, is there?" Rachel's voice carried a note of challenge. "I mean, you could have left the military when you had Tommy. Lots of women do. They prioritize motherhood over career advancement." The accusation was subtle but unmistakable. I had chosen my career over my child, and everything that followed was my own fault. "That's not how military service works," I began, but Rachel cut me off. "Look, I'm not trying to judge your choices," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "I'm just saying Tommy's been through a lot, and he needs consistency right now. Moving him back and forth between our houses might confuse him even more." Our houses, as if Tommy belonged equally in both places rather than primarily in his own home with his mother. I was starting to see how skillfully Rachel had blurred the lines, making temporary childcare arrangements sound like permanent custody agreements, while positioning any attempt to reclaim my role as potentially harmful to Tommy's well-being. Over the next several days, this pattern continued and intensified. Every suggestion I made was met with gentle resistance, framed as concern for Tommy's stability. When I wanted to enroll him in a different day camp closer to our apartment, Rachel reminded me that he'd already made friends at his current program, and change would be traumatic. When I tried to adjust his bedtime to match our old routine, she explained that Dr. Peterson had recommended his current sleep schedule for optimal emotional regulation. When I suggested reducing his time at her house so we could rebuild our own relationship, she worried that cutting him off from his established support system would trigger his abandonment anxiety. Each conversation left me feeling more frustrated and powerless, like I was fighting for custody of my own child against someone who had home field advantage. Rachel had spent 18 months establishing herself as the primary caregiver while I was gone, and now she wielded that position like a weapon, using professional terminology and expert opinions to justify maintaining control over every aspect of Tommy's life. The breaking point came when I discovered that Rachel had scheduled Tommy for a therapy session without consulting me. I only found out when he mentioned it casually, saying he had to see Dr. Peterson the next day to talk about feeling confused about Mommy being back. The idea that my return was being treated as a source of confusion rather than joy felt like the final insult in a series of psychological manipulations. "You can't schedule medical appointments for my son without my permission," I told Rachel when I called to confront her about it. "It's not medical, it's therapeutic," she corrected, as if the distinction mattered. "And Dr. Peterson specifically requested to see Tommy after your return to assess how he's adjusting. She's concerned about his emotional well-being during this transition." Transition. Another loaded word that made my homecoming sound temporary and disruptive rather than permanent and healing. I was beginning to understand that every conversation with Rachel was a minefield of carefully chosen language designed to undermine my authority while making her sound reasonable and concerned. "I want to speak with Dr. Peterson myself," I said firmly, "before Tommy sees her again." Of course, Rachel agreed readily. "I'm sure she'd love to meet with you. She's very interested in understanding the family dynamics and how they've affected Tommy's development." The way she said it made it clear that these family dynamics were problematic and that I was the source of the problems. That night, as I tucked Tommy into bed using the elaborate routine Rachel had established, I tried one more time to connect with the little boy I'd left behind. "Do you remember when we used to read the dinosaur book together?" I asked, pulling the familiar volume from his shelf. "You knew all their names, and you'd roar like a T-Rex." Tommy nodded politely but didn't reach for the book. "Aunt Rachel reads different stories now," he said. "She does better voices." The casual dismissal hurt more than any tantrum or outright rejection would have. He wasn't angry with me. He simply preferred someone else, someone who had convinced him she was better at being his mother than I was. Would you like me to try the voices? I offered, opening the book hopefully. That's okay, Tommy said, settling back against his pillows. I'm tired. He closed his eyes, effectively ending the conversation and leaving me sitting alone beside his bed with a book full of memories he no longer seemed to share. As I turned off his light and closed his door, I realized that Rachel had accomplished something far more devastating than simple childcare. She hadn't just taken care of Tommy in my absence, she had systematically replaced me in his life while teaching him to see my return as temporary and potentially harmful. She had used my service to my country as evidence of abandonment, twisted my sacrifice into selfishness, and positioned herself as the stable, loving constant while painting me as the unreliable disruptor. Standing in my hallway listening to my son's quiet breathing, I felt more alone than I had during the loneliest nights of deployment. At least then I'd had hope, the knowledge that I was coming home to someone who loved and needed me. Now I was home, but the child I'd dreamed of reuniting with had been taught to need someone else, someone who had convinced him that loving me was dangerous because I would inevitably leave again. But as I stood there in the darkness of my own home, feeling like a stranger in the life I'd fought to protect, I made a promise to myself and to the sleeping child behind the closed door. I wouldn't let Rachel's manipulation become permanent. I wouldn't allow my sister to steal my son's love while hiding behind therapeutic language and false concern. Whatever it took, however long the fight lasted, I would reclaim my place in Tommy's life and show him that some promises, the ones that really matter, are worth keeping. The war I'd fought overseas was over, but the battle for my son's heart was just beginning, and this time I wasn't fighting for my country or my duty or my honor. I was fighting for the most important thing in the world, the chance to be the mother Tommy deserved, and the chance to prove that coming home isn't abandonment, it's love made manifest after the longest, most necessary absence of our lives. The appointment with Dr. Peterson was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and I spent the weekend preparing for what felt like the most important conversation of my life. I researched child psychology, military family dynamics, and deployment reintegration, arming myself with facts and statistics that might counter whatever narrative Rachel had been spinning. But nothing could have prepared me for the sterile office with its pastel walls and the woman behind the desk who looked at me like I was a case study rather than a concerned mother. Peterson was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with perfectly styled auburn hair and an expression of professional sympathy that immediately set me on edge. She gestured for me to sit in one of the overstuffed chairs across from her desk, the kind designed to make people feel comfortable while discussing uncomfortable truths. Mitchell, she began, consulting a thick file that I assumed contained detailed notes about my son's alleged psychological trauma. Thank you for coming in. Rachel has told me so much about the family situation, and I'm eager to hear your perspective on Tommy's adjustment challenges. Adjustment challenges. Before I could even introduce myself, she was already framing my return as problematic. I'd like to understand what exactly you think Tommy is adjusting to, I said carefully. I'm his mother. I've been deployed, and now I'm home. That should be a positive development, not a challenge. Dr. Peterson nodded with the kind of patronizing understanding that made my skin crawl. Of course, from an adult perspective, reunion should be joyful. But children experience these transitions differently. Tommy has expressed significant anxiety about your return, particularly fears that you'll leave again without warning. Leave again without warning, I repeated, my voice rising slightly. I didn't leave without warning the first time. I was deployed. There's a difference between military service and abandonment. Certainly, Dr. Peterson agreed, but her tone suggested she didn't really see the distinction. However, Tommy was quite young when you left, and his understanding of the situation was necessarily limited. From his perspective, Mommy was here one day and gone the next, and he had no way of knowing if or when you'd return. I felt my jaw clench as I realized how thoroughly Rachel must have poisoned this woman's understanding of our situation. Did Rachel mention that Tommy and I had regular video calls throughout my deployment, that I sent packages and letters, that I maintained contact despite being in a war zone? Dr. Peterson flipped through her notes, frowning slightly. Rachel did mention some video calls, yes, but she indicated they became increasingly sporadic and that Tommy often became distressed afterward. She felt it might be better to limit contact to prevent additional emotional upheaval. The room seemed to tilt sideways as the full scope of Rachel's manipulation became clear. She hadn't just been caring for Tommy in my absence, she'd been actively sabotaging our relationship, limiting our contact while telling a therapist that I was the one causing distress. Every missed call I'd attributed to technical difficulties or scheduling conflicts had been deliberate interference designed to weaken the bond between my son and me. "How often did Rachel say we talked?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. According to her records, perhaps once or twice a month, and usually quite briefly. She was concerned that longer conversations were overstimulating for Tommy and contributing to his behavioral issues. Records. Rachel had been keeping records of our communications and using them as evidence against me. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to my call log, screenshots I'd taken of our video sessions, and the detailed journal I'd kept of every interaction with my son during deployment. "I have documentation of 47 video calls over 18 months, I said, turning my phone screen toward Dr. Peterson. "Some lasting over an hour. We talked about his day, his toys, his friends. He showed me pictures he'd drawn and told me stories about preschool. Does that sound like sporadic, distressing contact to you?" Dr. Peterson's confident expression faltered slightly as she looked at the evidence I was presenting. Rachel indicated that these calls were less frequent, and that Tommy often had difficulty afterward. "Rachel was lying," I said bluntly, abandoning any pretense of diplomatic language. "She's been systematically undermining my relationship with my son, and apparently using you as an unwitting accomplice in the process." The therapist straightened in her chair, her professional demeanor becoming more defensive. "Miss Mitchell, I understand you're upset, but Rachel has been nothing but concerned for Tommy's well-being. She's brought him to every appointment, provided detailed information about his emotional state, and has been instrumental in helping him process his feelings about your absence." His feelings about my absence, or the feelings she's taught him to have about my absence? I countered, because there's a significant difference between a child naturally missing his deployed mother and a child being conditioned to see that mother as unreliable and abandoning. Dr. Peterson was quiet for a long moment, studying the phone screen I still held toward her. "These call logs are quite detailed," she admitted slowly. "Rachel's recollection seems to differ significantly from your documentation." "Rachel's recollection is a fabrication," I said firmly. "And I can prove it." I scrolled through my photo gallery until I found what I was looking for, a screenshot from one of our video calls showing Tommy holding up a drawing he'd made for me, his face bright with excitement as he explained each crayon mark. "Does this look like a distressed child to you?" The image spoke louder than any argument I could make. Tommy's genuine joy was unmistakable, his eager engagement obvious even through a phone screen. Dr. Peterson stared at the photo for several seconds before looking back at her notes with visible confusion. "I'm going to need to reassess some of my assumptions about this case," she said finally. "If your documentation is accurate, then the information I've been given about your relationship with Tommy may be incomplete." "It's not incomplete," I corrected. "It's deliberately false. My sister has spent 18 months convincing you, and more importantly convincing Tommy, that I'm an unreliable mother who abandoned him. She's used my military service as evidence of neglect while positioning herself as his primary caregiver and emotional support." Dr. Peterson set down her pen and leaned back in her chair, the wheels of professional analysis clearly turning as she reconsidered everything she thought she knew about our family dynamics. "If what you're suggesting is true, that would represent a serious breach of trust and potentially harmful interference in the therapeutic process." "What I'm suggesting is absolutely true," I said, pulling up more evidence on my phone. "I have emails where I asked Rachel about Tommy's daily routine, his favorite foods, his sleep patterns. She responded with detailed information while simultaneously telling you that I was absent and uncaring. She's been playing both sides, maintaining the illusion that she was keeping me informed while actually limiting my involvement and using that limitation as evidence against me." The therapist's expression had shifted from professional sympathy to genuine concern, and I could see her beginning to understand the sophisticated nature of Rachel's manipulation. "Mitchell, if these allegations are accurate, I need to inform you that the treatment plan I've developed for Tommy has been based on fundamentally flawed information." "What kind of treatment plan?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Doctor Peterson consulted her notes again, but now she was reading them with obvious skepticism rather than confidence. We've been working on managing his abandonment anxiety, teaching him coping strategies for when trusted adults leave unexpectedly, and helping him understand that some relationships aren't permanent or reliable. Each word felt like a physical blow. While I'd been fighting for my country and counting down the days until I could hold my son again, a licensed therapist had been teaching him that our relationship was unstable and that expecting permanence from me was unrealistic. Rachel hadn't just poisoned Tommy's mind against me, she'd found a professional ally to validate and reinforce those toxic messages. "You've been teaching my 4-year-old son that his mother is unreliable," I said, my voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Based on information provided by someone who has been actively sabotaging our relationship. I've been treating a child who presented with significant anxiety and behavioral issues." Dr. Peterson replied defensively, but her tone lacked its earlier conviction. "The treatment was appropriate based on the information available to me." "The information available to you was lies," I said bluntly, "and now my son believes those lies because a professional has been reinforcing them for months. Do you understand what you've done? Do you understand how difficult it's going to be to undo this damage?" Dr. Peterson was quiet for several minutes, presumably processing the implications of what I was telling her. When she finally spoke, her voice was subdued and uncertain. "If your version of events is accurate, then we need to completely reassess Tommy's case. The therapeutic approach would need to change dramatically." "My version of events isn't a version," I corrected. "It's documented fact. And yes, the approach needs to change, starting with you understanding that the problem isn't my son's relationship with me. The problem is my sister's interference in that relationship and the professional validation she's received for that interference." I spent the next hour walking Dr. Peterson through the evidence I'd compiled, showing her photos from our video calls, screenshots of emails where Rachel had provided updates while simultaneously undermining me, and detailed logs of every interaction I'd had with Tommy during deployment. By the end of our session, the therapist looked visibly shaken, her earlier confidence replaced by the kind of professional uncertainty that comes from discovering you've been manipulated by a client. "I need to schedule an immediate session with Tommy," she said finally. "And I need to review all of Rachel's statements in light of this new information. If she has been deliberately providing false information, that represents not just a breach of trust but potentially harmful interference in a child's psychological development. What does that mean for Tommy?" I asked. "How do we fix what's been done to him?" Dr. Peterson rubbed her temples, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of the situation. "Honestly, Miss Mitchell, this is unlike anything I've encountered in my practice. We're talking about systematic psychological manipulation of a child by a trusted caregiver, validated by professional therapeutic intervention. The damage could be significant, and the recovery process will be complex." The word damage hit me like a physical blow. My sister hadn't just interfered with my relationship with Tommy, she'd potentially caused lasting psychological harm while hiding behind the authority of professional therapy. The scope of her manipulation was breathtaking in its cruelty and sophistication. "I want to be present for Tommy's next session," I said firmly. "I want to hear what he's been taught to say about me, and I want to begin the process of correcting those false beliefs." Dr. Peterson nodded reluctantly. "That's probably advisable, though we'll need to be very careful about how we approach this. Tommy has been operating under a particular understanding of reality for months now. Challenging that understanding too quickly could be traumatic. What's traumatic is teaching a child that his mother abandoned him when she was actually serving her country," I replied. "But I understand we need to be strategic about undoing the damage." That afternoon, I confronted Rachel directly. I called her and asked her to meet me at a coffee shop near her office, neutral territory where we could have a conversation without Tommy overhearing. She arrived looking perfectly put together as always, her smile bright and seemingly genuine as she embraced me in a hug that felt like performance art. "How did your meeting with Dr. Peterson go?" she asked, as we settled into a quiet corner booth. "I know she's been eager to meet you and get your perspective on Tommy's situation." "My perspective on the situation you've created, you mean," I said, abandoning any pretense of sisterly pleasantry. "I know what you've been doing, Rachel. I know about the limited contact, the false information you've been feeding Dr. Peterson, the systematic way you've been undermining my relationship with my son. Rachel's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in her eyes. I don't know what you mean, Sarah. I've been taking care of Tommy while you were gone. I've been trying to help him understand why his mother wasn't here when he needed her. By convincing him that I abandoned him, by limiting our video calls and then telling his therapist that I was absent and uncaring. By teaching him to see my military service as evidence that I don't love him. I've been honest with Tommy about the situation, Rachel replied, her tone taking on that familiar note of righteous justification. Children deserve honesty, even when the truth is painful. You chose your career over your family, and Tommy needed to understand that some people make those choices. There it was, the core of her narrative laid bare. In Rachel's version of reality, my military service was a choice I'd made selfishly, prioritizing career advancement over motherhood. She'd taken an honorable deployment and twisted it into evidence of maternal neglect, then used that false narrative to justify taking over my role in Tommy's life. I didn't choose my career over my family, I said through gritted teeth. I fulfilled my military obligation while maintaining constant contact with my son. You're the one who interfered with that contact and then used that interference as evidence against me. Rachel's expression shifted to one of practiced concern, the look she'd perfected over the years whenever she needed to deliver harsh truths wrapped in false compassion. Sarah, I understand you're upset, but you need to think about what's best for Tommy. He's been through a traumatic experience, and he's finally starting to heal. Disrupting his stability now could set back months of progress. His stability, I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You mean the stability of believing his mother doesn't love him? The stability of learning not to trust promises or expect permanence from the people who should be constant in his life. I mean the stability of having consistent caregivers who prioritize his needs over their own ambitions. Rachel shot back, her facade of concern cracking slightly to reveal the judgment underneath. Tommy has thrived in my care, Sarah. He's happy, healthy, and secure. Are you really going to disrupt that because of your own guilt and insecurity? The accusation hung between us like a weapon. Rachel was suggesting that my desire to reclaim my relationship with my son was motivated by guilt rather than love, selfishness rather than legitimate parental concern. It was a masterful manipulation, turning my natural desire to be Tommy's mother into evidence of my unsuitability for the role. I'm not disrupting anything, I said firmly. I'm correcting a massive deception that you've perpetrated against my child. And if you think I'm going to stand by and let you continue poisoning his mind against me, you're seriously mistaken. Rachel's mask slipped further, revealing something harder and more calculating underneath. And what exactly do you think you're going to do about it? Tommy is happy with our arrangement. He feels safe and loved and secure. Are you going to rip him away from all of that just to satisfy your own need to play mother? Play mother. The phrase was designed to cut deep, implying that my role as Tommy's parent was somehow less legitimate than Rachel's self-appointed position as his primary caregiver. It was the culmination of months of subtle undermining, the final piece of a narrative that painted me as the interloper in my own child's life. I'm not playing anything, I said, my voice deadly quiet. I am his mother. That's not a role I auditioned for or a game I'm playing. It's a biological and legal fact that no amount of manipulation on your part can change. Biology doesn't make you a mother, Sarah, Rachel replied with cruel satisfaction. Being there does. Showing up does. Putting your child's needs ahead of your own desires does. And by those measures, I've been more of a mother to Tommy than you've been for the past year and a half. The words were designed to wound, and they succeeded. Rachel had identified my deepest fear, the guilt that every deployed parent carries about missing precious time with their children, and weaponized it against me. She'd taken the sacrifice I'd made in service to my country and perverted it into evidence of maternal failure. You're right about one thing, I said, standing up from the table. Being there matters. Showing up matters. And that's exactly what I'm going to do from now on. I'm going to be there for every doctor's appointment, every therapy session, every school event, and every bedtime. I'm going to show up for my son in ways that make it impossible for you to continue this charade. Rachel's confident expression wavered slightly, but she recovered quickly. Tommy doesn't want that, Sarah. He's made it clear that he's comfortable with our current arrangement. Are you going to force yourself on a child who's already expressed his preferences? Tommy is 4 years old, I replied. He doesn't get to make decisions about custody and living arrangements, and his current preferences are the result of months of systematic manipulation by someone he trusted. I'm going to fix that, Rachel. I'm going to undo every lie you've told him and restore the relationship you've tried so hard to destroy. As I walked away from that coffee shop, I felt something I hadn't experienced since returning from deployment: clarity. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that had surrounded me since coming home was finally lifting, replaced by a fierce determination to reclaim my place in Tommy's life. Rachel had overplayed her hand, and her manipulation was now exposed for what it truly was. But my confidence was short-lived. That evening, when I picked Tommy up from Rachel's house for what I thought would be our first normal night together, he seemed different. More withdrawn, more anxious, constantly looking toward the door as if expecting Rachel to rescue him from an uncomfortable situation. "Are you okay, buddy?" I asked as we sat down for dinner at our kitchen table. Tommy nodded but didn't meet my eyes. "Aunt Rachel said, you might be confused about some things," he said quietly. "She said sometimes adults get mixed up and think things that aren't true." The manipulation was immediate and sophisticated. Rachel had used our confrontation as an opportunity to preemptively undermine anything I might tell Tommy about our relationship. She'd planted the idea that I was confused or delusional, creating a framework that would make him skeptical of any attempt I made to correct the false narrative she'd constructed. "What kind of things did she say I might be confused about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral despite the rage building in my chest. "About why you went away," Tommy said, still not looking at me, "and about whether you really want to be here now. She said sometimes people say things they don't mean because they feel bad about their choices." Rachel had prepared for my counterattack by poisoning Tommy against it in advance. Any attempt I made to explain the truth about my deployment, my constant attempts to maintain contact, or my genuine desire to be his mother would now be filtered through the lens of confusion and guilt that she'd carefully constructed. "Tommy," I said, kneeling down to his level and taking his small hands in mine, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. I went away because it was my job, not because I wanted to leave you. I thought about you every single day, and I called you as often as I could. I came back because I love you and because this is where I belong." Tommy listened politely, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes, the way he'd learned to doubt declarations of love and permanence. Rachel had done her work too well, creating a child who was too young to understand the complexities of adult manipulation, but old enough to absorb its toxic effects. That night, after Tommy had gone to sleep using the elaborate routine that still felt foreign and imposed, I sat in my living room and called my commanding officer. Colonel Martinez had been supportive during my deployment, and I hoped she might have advice for navigating this impossible situation. "Mitchell," she said when she answered, her voice warm but concerned. "How's the reintegration going?" "Honestly, ma'am, it's been more challenging than the deployment itself," I admitted. "I'm dealing with some family issues that are affecting my ability to reconnect with my son." I explained the situation as objectively as I could, focusing on the documented interference with our communication and the false information that had been provided to Tommy's therapist. Colonel Martinez listened without interruption, but I could hear her growing concern as the scope of the manipulation became clear. "Mitchell, what you're describing sounds like parental alienation," she said finally. "I've seen similar cases with divorced couples, but never involving extended family. Have you considered legal action?" Legal action, the idea hadn't occurred to me, but as Colonel Martinez explained the concept of parental alienation and the legal remedies available, I began to understand that Rachel's behavior might not just be unethical but actually illegal. The systematic undermining of a parent-child relationship, especially using false information and professional manipulation, could constitute grounds for a custody challenge. "The problem is going to be proving intent," Colonel Martinez warned. "Your sister could claim she was acting in Tommy's best interests, that she genuinely believed you were absent and uncaring. But if you have documentation of her interference with your communication attempts, that could be compelling evidence. I spent the next several hours going through my records, compiling a comprehensive timeline of Rachel's interference and manipulation. The evidence was damning: emails where she'd agreed to facilitate video calls that never happened, therapy notes based on false information she'd provided, and a pattern of systematically replacing my role in Tommy's life, while portraying herself as the reluctant but necessary substitute. But even as I built my case against Rachel, I knew that the legal system was only part of the solution. The real damage was psychological, and it would require more than court orders to repair. Tommy had been taught to distrust me at a fundamental level, conditioned to see my love as temporary and my promises as unreliable. Undoing that conditioning would require patience, consistency, and professional help from someone who understood the true nature of what had been done to him. The next morning brought a call from Dr. Peterson requesting an emergency session. She'd spent the weekend reviewing her notes and consulting with colleagues about the ethical implications of the situation. When I arrived at her office, she looked haggard and deeply troubled.
Miss Mitchell, I've been practicing for 8 years, and I've never encountered a case quite like this, she began without preamble. The level of systematic deception your sister has employed is frankly staggering. She's essentially used my professional authority to validate and reinforce what appears to be a deliberately constructed false narrative. What does that mean for Tommy? I asked. And what does it mean for you professionally? Dr. Peterson sighed heavily. For Tommy, it means we need to completely restructure his treatment. Instead of managing abandonment anxiety, we need to focus on helping him distinguish between reality and the false beliefs that have been instilled in him. That's going to be a delicate and potentially lengthy process. She paused, clearly struggling with the professional implications of what she was admitting. As for me, I need to report this to my licensing board. Rachel's behavior represents a serious breach of the therapeutic process, and I have an obligation to document what's occurred and ensure it doesn't happen to other families. The idea that Rachel might face professional consequences for her manipulation was satisfying, but I was more concerned with immediate practical matters. How do we help Tommy understand what's really happened without traumatizing him further? Very carefully, Dr. Peterson replied. We can't simply tell a 4-year-old that his trusted caregiver has been lying to him for months. That would shatter his ability to trust anyone. Instead, we need to gradually introduce alternative narratives and help him develop his own understanding of reality based on evidence rather than the stories he's been told. It was a complex therapeutic challenge, made more difficult by the fact that Tommy would continue to see Rachel regularly, unless I took legal action to limit her access. Every visit to her house was an opportunity for her to reinforce the false narrative, to undermine whatever progress we made in therapy, and to maintain her position as his primary emotional attachment. I think I need to involve a family court, I said reluctantly. This isn't something we can resolve through therapy alone, not while Rachel continues to have unlimited access to Tommy. Dr. Peterson nodded grimly. I agree, and I'll provide whatever documentation and testimony you need to support your case. What Rachel has done goes far beyond typical family conflict. This is systematic psychological manipulation of a child, and it needs to stop. As I left Dr. Peterson's office that day, I felt the weight of the battle ahead. This wasn't just about correcting false beliefs or restoring a damaged relationship. This was about protecting my son from ongoing psychological manipulation by someone who had used his trust and innocence as weapons against his own mother. The fight would be difficult, expensive, and emotionally exhausting, but for Tommy's sake, it was a fight I had to win. The war overseas had ended when I boarded that plane home. But the war for my son's mind and heart was just beginning, and this time I wouldn't let anyone convince me that defending my family was anything other than the most important mission of my life. 3 months later, I stood in Judge Harrison's courtroom watching Rachel's carefully constructed facade finally crumble under cross-examination. My attorney, Jennifer Walsh, had methodically presented evidence of the systematic manipulation: recorded phone calls where Rachel contradicted her previous statements, email chains proving she'd deliberately blocked my communication attempts, and Dr. Peterson's devastating testimony about the false information that had shaped Tommy's therapy. Mrs. Stevens, Jennifer addressed Rachel, her voice sharp and professional. You testified that Miss Mitchell rarely attempted to contact her son during deployment.
Yet we have documentation of 47 blocked or redirected calls. Can you explain this discrepancy? Rachel's composure, which had held for weeks of proceedings, finally began to crack. I was protecting Tommy from disappointment, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah made promises she couldn't keep, and it was harmful for him to get his hopes up. Protecting him from his mother's love. Jennifer pressed, or protecting your own position as his primary caregiver. The courtroom was silent except for the soft sound of the court reporter's fingers on her keyboard. I watched Rachel's face cycle through emotions, anger, desperation, and finally something that looked almost like relief. The burden of maintaining her elaborate deception for so long had clearly taken its toll. I gave that child everything, Rachel said suddenly, her voice rising. I was there every night when he cried for his mother. I was there for every scraped knee, every nightmare, every milestone. Where was Sarah, fighting someone else's war while her son forgot what she looked like? There it was, the raw truth beneath all the manipulation. Rachel genuinely believed that my military service was abandonment, that her presence during my absence made her more deserving of Tommy's love than his actual mother. In her mind, she hadn't stolen my son, she'd rescued him from a mother who chose duty over devotion. Judge Harrison, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and penetrating eyes, leaned forward in her chair. Mrs. Stevens, regardless of your personal feelings about Miss Mitchell's career choices, did you or did you not deliberately interfere with communications between a deployed service member and her minor child? The question hung in the air like a sword. Rachel looked around the courtroom desperately, perhaps hoping for support that would never come. Her boyfriend Mike sat in the gallery, his face a mask of embarrassment and disappointment. Even he seemed to understand that what Rachel had done crossed fundamental lines of decency and law. I did what I thought was best for Tommy, Rachel said finally, her voice defeated. That's not what I asked, Judge Harrison replied firmly. Did you interfere with communications, yes or no? Yes, Rachel whispered. The single word changed everything. After months of gaslighting, manipulation, and carefully constructed lies, Rachel had finally admitted the truth under oath. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this legal victory was only the beginning of rebuilding my relationship with Tommy. Judge Harrison's ruling was swift and decisive. Supervised visitation for Rachel, mandatory family therapy for all of us, and immediate restoration of my full parental rights, with Tommy returning to live with me permanently. The judge also ordered Rachel to pay for Tommy's therapeutic treatment, acknowledging that her actions had caused measurable psychological harm that would require professional intervention to address. But the real transformation had already begun weeks earlier, in Dr. Peterson's office, as Tommy slowly started to understand that the stories he'd been told about me weren't the whole truth. The breakthrough came during a session where Dr. Peterson asked him to draw a picture of his family before I went away. I don't remember, Tommy had said initially, clutching his crayons uncertainly. That's okay, Dr. Peterson replied gently. Just draw what feels right in your heart. The picture that emerged was revealing. Tommy drew himself in the center, surrounded by multiple figures. Me in my uniform, Rachel, Mike, even our old dog Charlie, who had died before my deployment. But in this drawing, I wasn't separated from the family unit. I was part of it, connected to Tommy by a line he'd colored bright red. Tell me about this line, Dr. Peterson had asked. That's the love line, Tommy explained matter-of-factly. It goes from Mommy's heart to mine. Aunt Rachel said it broke when Mommy went away, but I think maybe it just got really, really long. The innocence of his explanation broke my heart, and gave me hope at the same time. Despite months of manipulation, some part of Tommy had preserved our connection, had refused to believe that love could simply disappear because of distance. That resilient kernel of truth became the foundation for rebuilding everything else. Recovery wasn't linear or easy. There were setbacks, moments when Tommy would retreat into the defensive patterns Rachel had taught him, times when he'd test my promises about staying by pushing boundaries or creating conflicts. But Dr. Peterson helped me understand that these behaviors were normal for a child who'd been taught not to trust parental love. He's essentially been trained to expect abandonment, she explained during one of our sessions. So he's going to keep testing whether you'll prove that expectation right. Your job is to consistently prove it wrong, no matter how challenging his behavior becomes. The testing was exhausting. Tommy would deliberately misbehave before bedtime, as if trying to give me reasons to send him away. He'd ask repeatedly when I was going back to the army, no matter how many times I explained that my service commitment was complete. He'd mention Rachel constantly, comparing everything I did to her supposedly superior methods. But gradually, painfully, trust began to rebuild. The first breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday evening when Tommy fell and scraped his knee on the playground. Instead of crying for Rachel as he'd done for months, he ran to me with his arms outstretched, seeking the comfort that felt natural and instinctive despite everything that had tried to sever that bond. "Mommy, it hurts," he sobbed against my shoulder, and I realized it was the first time since my return that he'd turned to me first for comfort rather than as a last resort. "I know, baby," I whispered, holding him close while examining the minor scrape. "Mommy's here, I've got you." That night, for the first time in months, Tommy asked me to read him a bedtime story. Not because Rachel wasn't available, not because it was part of a supervised routine, but because he wanted me there. He chose one of our old favorites, the dinosaur book we'd read together countless times before my deployment. "Do you remember the T-Rex voice?" he asked, as I opened to the first page. "I might be a little rusty," I admitted, "but I can try." As I read in the exaggerated roar we'd perfected years earlier, Tommy giggled with genuine delight. The sound was like music, a reminder of who we'd been together before everything got so complicated. When I finished the story, he looked up at me with eyes that seemed clearer somehow, less clouded by confusion and conflicting loyalties. "Mommy," he said quietly, "I missed the T-Rex voice. I missed reading it to you," I replied, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "Did you really think about me every day when you were gone?" The question was asked with the careful vulnerability of a child who'd been taught not to trust expressions of love but desperately wanted to believe them anyway. I pulled out my phone and showed him the folder of screenshots I'd taken during our video calls, the photos of care packages I'd sent, the pictures of letters I'd written to him. "Every single day," I said softly. "Even when we couldn't talk, even when the internet was bad or the time zones made it hard, I thought about you. I carried pictures of you with me everywhere I went." Tommy studied the evidence with the seriousness of a much older child, processing information that contradicted months of carefully constructed narratives. "Aunt Rachel said you forgot about me sometimes." "Aunt Rachel was wrong about a lot of things," I said carefully. Dr. Peterson had coached me on how to address Rachel's lies without completely destroying Tommy's ability to trust other adults. Sometimes people say things that aren't true because they're scared or confused. But forgetting you, that could never happen, not even if I tried. The conversation marked a turning point. Over the following weeks, Tommy began asking more questions about my deployment, about the video calls he barely remembered, about the reasons I'd had to go away. Each question was an opportunity to replace false narratives with truth, to help him understand that my service was about protection and duty rather than abandonment and choice. Rachel's supervised visits became increasingly difficult for her, as Tommy's loyalties shifted back toward their natural center. She'd arrive with elaborate plans and expensive gifts, trying to recreate the special bond they'd shared during my absence. But Tommy, with the brutal honesty of childhood, began to see through the performance. "Why did you tell me Mommy didn't want to talk to me?" he asked Rachel directly during one visit, while the court-appointed supervisor looked on with professional interest. Rachel's face went pale. "I never said that, sweetheart. I said Mommy was busy with her work." "No," Tommy insisted with the confidence of a child who'd finally found his voice. "You said she was too busy to remember me, but she showed me all the times she tried to call, and you said we were at the store or taking a nap." The supervisor made notes as Rachel struggled to respond without admitting to deliberate interference. These sessions became less about maintaining Rachel's relationship with Tommy and more about documenting the extent of her manipulation for the court record. But perhaps the most powerful moment of healing came unexpectedly, on a Saturday morning 6 months after the court ruling. Tommy and I were making pancakes together, flour dusting the kitchen counter, and both of us covered in batter, when he looked up at me with an expression of sudden realization. "Mommy," he said, "I remember now." "Remember what, buddy?" "Before you went away, I remember the dinosaur voices in the park, and how you used to sing the cleanup song. I remember being happy." The simple statement carried enormous weight. For months, Rachel had convinced Tommy that his memories of our life together were unreliable, that any happiness he'd felt with me was either imagined or insignificant, compared to the stability she provided. But as trust rebuilt and manipulation faded, his authentic memories began to surface. We were happy, I confirmed, flipping a pancake with perhaps unnecessary enthusiasm. And we're going to be happy again, different than before, because we've both grown and changed, but happy in our own way. Tommy nodded solemnly, then broke into a grin. Can we make dinosaur-shaped pancakes? Absolutely, I laughed, though they might look more like blob-shaped dinosaurs. As we worked together, creating misshapen pancakes and making increasingly ridiculous dinosaur sounds, I felt something settle into place that had been dislocated for far too long. This was what Rachel had tried to destroy, not just my relationship with Tommy, but his ability to trust and love that didn't come with conditions, promises that weren't dependent on perfect behavior, connections that could survive separation and emerge stronger. A year later, Tommy started kindergarten. I walked him to his classroom on the first day, his small hand gripping mine with confidence rather than anxiety. When other children asked about his family, he pointed me out proudly as my mommy who was a soldier. The shame and confusion that had once surrounded my service had been replaced by the kind of matter-of-fact pride that comes naturally to children who haven't been taught to see love as conditional. Rachel remained in our lives, but in a drastically reduced capacity. The supervised visits had ended, replaced by occasional family gatherings where her interactions with Tommy were limited and closely watched. She'd undergone her own therapy, working through the complex emotions that had led her to believe that stealing a child's love was an act of protection rather than cruelty. I convinced myself I was saving him, she'd admitted during one painful family session. I genuinely believed that you were going to hurt him by leaving again, and I thought if he didn't depend on you, he'd be safer. The admission didn't excuse what she'd done, but it provided context that helped Tommy understand that people can do terrible things for reasons they believe are good. It was a complex lesson for a young child, but one that Dr. Peterson felt was important for his long-term emotional development. Adults make mistakes too, Tommy had said after that session. Big bad mistakes sometimes. Yes, they do, I'd agreed. But the important thing is that we learn from those mistakes and work to make things better. Today, as I write this, Tommy is 7 years old. He still sees Dr. Peterson occasionally, but more for routine check-ins than crisis intervention. He talks openly about the time when Aunt Rachel got confused about our family, but without the trauma that once accompanied those memories. He understands that some adults did things that hurt him, but he also understands that he's safe now, that his family is stable, and that love doesn't disappear just because someone says it does. Military families face unique challenges, but we've learned that the bonds between parent and child are remarkably resilient when nurtured with honesty and consistency. My deployment didn't damage Tommy, Rachel's manipulation did. My service didn't abandon him, her interference tried to. But love, when it's genuine and persistent, has a way of surviving even the most sophisticated attempts to destroy it. The little boy who once drew family pictures without his mother now includes me in every scene, often in my uniform, always connected to him by that bright red love line that proved to be stronger than anyone imagined. We've built something new together, a relationship that acknowledges the pain of separation while celebrating the joy of reunion, that honors the complexity of military service, while affirming the simplicity of parental love. Some battles are fought with weapons and strategy. Others are fought with patience and truth. Both require courage, but the war for a child's heart demands a different kind of strength, the willingness to love consistently even when that love is rejected, questioned, or deliberately undermined. It's a battle worth fighting, because at stake is not just a relationship, but a child's ability to trust in the permanence of love itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.